This is Marion Law's confrontation with the Melbourne Man, as found in the book Two Churches Only by Christian Markham. This is about a missionary's run-in with a communist elite leader, which details the communist plan, which is obviously Satan's plan. Marion Albert Law worked in the LDS Church educational system for many years. He worked with BOU President Wilkinson in the 1960s and 70s, and often worked closely with the First Presidency and Apostles on a variety of matters. Back in 1983, he gave a fireside in which he detailed an extremely unique experience an LDS missionary serving in Melbourne, Australia, had back in 1947. A recording was made of this fireside, which was transcribed into a talk and posted online at a few LDS-based websites. However, his talk meanders a bit mid-topic and has some unintelligible moments from either a poor or degraded recording, and parts of it do not flow well as a narrative. As interest in his story grew, in 2010, Brother Marion Law composed a tighter, more direct retelling. The following is a complete reproduction of this 2010 autobiographical account. In 1947, I was a 21-year-old missionary elder for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. My assignment was in Melbourne, Australia. My companion and I were going door to door in a quaint little section of the city. The lanes were narrow and wandered around, with no sense of plan at all. Missionaries are not supposed to leave their companions for any reason, but here in this compact area we decided to each take a side of the lane. Opportunities to teach anyone were so rare that we thought it wise to cover as much territory as possible. If a friendly reaction were received by one of us, the other would cross the street to share in the visit. Usually we could see each other every minute and could almost touch hands across the lane. So the plan was working well as we doubled our tracting efficiency. At one door, a man answered and said yes, he would like to hear more about our beliefs. I looked for my companion, but he had disappeared, so I tried to stall until the elder came back. He'd obviously gone around one of the numerous meanderings and should reappear at any moment. I explained that my companion would be back in a minute or two. Much later, I discovered that around the corner was a milk bar, where he had gone for a milkshake while he waited for me. The elder assumed that since I was right behind him, I would soon show up there. After a few more minutes, the man became impatient and said, I don't talk standing in the lane. If you're not interested, never mind. I said, okay, I'll come in. My intention was to visit briefly, make an appointment, and return with my wandering companion. As I began to explain our purpose, he interrupted. Mr. Law, we have a better plan. So I asked about his better plan. The Melbourne Man, as I called him, described how Plato, an ancient Greek philosopher, had designated a different kind of society. This man's plan would follow similar lines. There would be three classes of people: the leaders, the workers, and the teachers. The teachers would be trained to condition a sinless society. As you call sin, he said. There would be no hate, no greed, no jealousy, no envy, no lust, no malice, no sin. The workers would not be envious of the leaders. The leaders would not oppress the workers. The teachers would condition each class to willingly accept their assigned role in this perfect society. The Melbourne Man further described how breeders would be chosen based on superior intelligence, physical perfection, and longevity genes. Children would be taken from their mothers at birth and placed in communal nurseries, and through various tests, their classes would be determined. They would then receive specialized conditioning for that particular class. All defective babies had to be eliminated. The total number of births would need to be controlled to prevent overpopulation and depletion of natural resources. By this selective breeding, a master race of geniuses could be created. Worker scientists were assigned to research life extension techniques until future generations could live forever. Through space research, they would reach out into the universe to develop planets hospitable to human life. This perfect society then spreads throughout space in a never-ending cycle. I asked, how will you condition them? He explained in detail the basic conditioning tools. They included diet, drugs, music, movies, education, etc. He described how diet, the basic elements of life, food, and water, could be a major desensitizing and conditioning instrument. The Melbourne man said that by using additives and special formulas, by changing plants and animals, i.e. chemicals, hormones, genetically engineered seed, GMO, etc., the diet of the people leaves them submissive and easily controlled. What that man told me that the materials, systems, and procedures were already in place in 1947, my farm boy mentality refused to accept it, especially when he explained drug addiction. He outlined how drug addiction changes personalities, making them so dependent that they will agree to anything to satisfy their needs. I protested that people will not allow themselves to be manipulated that way. He just laughed and said, "Mr. Law, you're such a child. Wait and see." I did not see how music could be used. The man then described melodic dissonance to me in detail. He told of the conditioning experience of the Russian scientist Pavlov in communist China using dogs and metronomes. Pavlov found that he could condition a dog to salivate when a metronome beat at 60 beats per minute. Then he learned that he could condition the same dog to never produce saliva when the metronome beat at 120 beats per minute. In another experiment with the same dog, Pavlov had both metronomes beating at the same time, one at 60 beats, the other at 120 beats per minute. The conditioned dog was required to do two totally opposite functions at the same time. This produced nervous shock, and the dog collapsed unconscious. Next, with the same dog, Pavlov had the 60-beat metronome suddenly jump to 120 beats per minute. At the same instant, the 20-beat metronome dropped to 60 beats per minute. This produced a melodic dissonance. When the metronomes were switched back and forth rapidly, the dog became so distressed that it died. In communist Russia, these experiments were then extended to humans, with similar results. Using variations of this melodic dissonance, a new music form was created. Musical scores and lyrics were developed. A team of musicians called the Beatles was trained in Europe and introduced to America on the popular Ed Sullivan talent show on national television. They were an instant hit, and all their forms of music became old-fashioned. I could not understand such a phenomenon in 1947, but years later, when I first heard rock and roll, everything flashed back to 1947. I realized that the Australian did know that it would be a powerful tool for their conditioning plan. The Melbourne man said they had already begun behavior modification conditioning in government schools, using audio-visual programs. When they introduce their messages, beginning in preschool, the results are intense and permanent. A monster was emerging that I found sinister and all-controlling. I could not believe what I was hearing, but over and over he said, "Wait and see. You will live to see our perfect plan in full operation. When we control all the conditioning processes, everything will fall neatly into place." I protested that they were forcing their will and control on people, taking away freedom of choice. His answer was, "No, they can still choose, but they will always choose exactly what they are conditioned to choose." But that's not right. He laughed at my evident simplicity, so I protested again, "But God won't allow it." "Why not? How can a just God, there is no such being, keep these sinless souls out of heaven? That's what you believe, isn't it, Mr. Law?" So he began a different tactic. "Who do you love, Mr. Law? You certainly don't love the Australian people." "Oh, yes, I do. That's why I came on a mission." "So how many have you saved?" This was a hard mission. Few and far between were our welcomes. Fewer were our converts. I admitted grudgingly, not many. And he said, "All the rest are consigned to hell." "Oh no, there are 3 degrees of glory, and..." "We know all about your 3 degrees of glory. It means that many are called to be Mormons, but few are chosen to be gods. We know all about your church. We control every church in the world except yours, and we will infiltrate that." "Mr. Law, you don't love anybody, do you?" "I love my mother." "No, you don't. Under your plan, she can either choose to go to hell or make a mistake and fall through the cracks into hell. If you really loved your mother, you'd be eager to guarantee that she would go to heaven. With Our plan, it is guaranteed. In fact, no one will be lost. They will all go to heaven. Of course, we don't believe in heaven or hell anyway. But if you really love your fellow man, our plan is the only way to show it. I said, I think I have heard this plan before. Where could you have heard it? It must have been in the council in heaven before I was born. He just laughed. I was reeling under his attack, but I could not leave. There were no chains on me, but I felt as if I was bound hand and foot to the chair, as though I was paralyzed. Editorial note, this is a form of spiritual attack, similar to what Joseph Smith experienced prior to his first vision. So I asked, who are you? What do you call this plan? I am one of the 3 members of the Central Planning Committee of the Communist Party for Australia. I said, I've heard of communism, but I knew very little about it. The Melbourne man told me that the world understood economic and political and military communism, but the plan he was outlining to me he called spiritual communism, that would evolve into a worldwide government. He said they were using the current governments until they controlled the world. Then those political, economic, and military leaders would need to be eliminated because they were violent men. Then the New World Order would take over. I asked how they could make the plan work when there are so many people who are not prepared to accept it. He said, we'll have to annihilate all who cannot be conditioned to be either a worker or teacher. How many will you kill? Hundreds of millions, maybe even you and me. But that is murder. That is a Christian term that has no meaning. It is really a part of cleansing. We need to reduce the population to a more manageable size anyway. Only the inner corps of the elite leaders know about the plan. The present communist leaders don't know it. Spiritual communism is not written or recorded anywhere. It is a secret plan. Then why did you tell me? He was a bit perplexed, but he had an answer. I don't know, but we are looking for zealous young men who will join this work to help bring about this heaven on earth. Think about it. Not one soul will be lost. I was not ready to give up yet. You'll never take over the world. He answered, Mr. Law, we now control 2/3 of all the world governments, politically or militarily or economically. Only the United States of America remains as the last major hurdle to world domination. So I boldly declared, you'll never take over the United States. But, he said, Mr. Law, let me tell you how it is. He said, they controlled all major conditioning instruments in America now. The entertainment industry, the news media, the education system, the courts, the financial system, political parties. Where they don't have full control, they have infiltrated and have embedded their agents into all important decision-making bodies. He said they control every agency that affects daily living in America. Their agents were everywhere, doing their jobs. But since I was a high school graduate, 12 years in an education system, I thought that made me an expert in education. Quite triumphantly, I said, you don't control the education system. Again, Mr. Law, let me tell you how it is. When you get home, examine any textbook in any school at any level, from preschool to university graduate school. You will find no mention of Jesus Christ or God or His plan. But you will find our plan being taught at every level. It's written into every textbook. How right he was. I've spent almost 40 years of my life in education as a teacher and an administrator in public and private school systems. Satan's plan is there. God's plan is forbidden by law. God has been declared unconstitutional by the United States Supreme Court. I asked when all this would take effect, when would all this take effect, and his spiritual plan be put into operation. He said, we have a progressive agenda. We are prepared to take 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 2 forward, 1 back, until it is time. The American people won't even know it is happening. When it is favorable, then everything will move swiftly to the purging or cleansing stage. People will be stunned into immobility. We won't want a time lag between takeover and full operation of our spiritual phase. Then he asked, what do you think? Are you ready to join our forces? I fell back to the only sure ground I knew. I believe in God, our Heavenly Father, and in His Son, Jesus Christ. It's their plan that I will follow. The Melbourne man became violently angry and shouted, "There are no such beings. They are myths created to enslave the minds of men. They don't exist." I answered simply, "But I have felt the power of the Holy Ghost fill me with fire from the top of my head to the soles of my feet, and I have heard the voice of God testify to me that Jesus Christ is His Son. His plan is the truth, and that is what I teach." He lunged across the room and attacked me with his fists. Suddenly I was free. I could move, and I ran outside into the lane. I found my companion wandering around, desperately looking for me. He didn't dare leave, but had kept on searching for me. He had to help me on and off the tram. I was so exhausted that I was unable to get out of bed for a couple of days. Editor's note: intense spiritual attacks are both physically and emotionally draining, as can be confronting difficult or painful truths. Elder Matthew Cowley of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles was president of all the Pacific missions. He visited us often in Australia. In my interview with him shortly after this experience, he sensed that something was disturbing me. He asked if I would like to tell him what was wrong. So I outlined the Melbourne man's spiritual communism to him. Elder Cowley told me why the man told me the plan. Now I had been permitted to hear Satan's plan in detail. I could choose which I would follow, Satan or Christ. 25 years after this event, I was in Ezra Taft Benson's office and told him the account. He said that he had never heard Satan's plan in this life, but he recognized the details that Satan's plan used to persuade 1/3 of our brothers and sisters to follow him in the pre-existence. They were willing to trade their agency to choose for Satan's guaranteed salvation. Now I could choose again which I would follow, Christ's plan of agency or Satan's plan of total control. After 63 years, my choice is more firmly anchored than ever before. I've watched spiritual communism eat its ghastly way into every country and into every government, including our own. It is everywhere. All 10 points of Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto have been quietly incorporated into American life. They have been accepted as social progress. The Book of Mormon tells how secret combinations destroyed 2 great civilizations, the Jaredites and the Nephites. The prophet Moroni warns us, "Wherefore the Lord commandeth you, when ye shall see these things coming among you, that ye shall awake to a sense of your awful situation, because of this secret combination which shall be among you." Ether 8:24. Are we awake? Evidences of the secret combination, spiritual communism, are everywhere. What can we do about it? When the Jaredites and Nephites followed the prophets, they were protected. When they rejected the prophets, they were destroyed. My only escape from the Melbourne man was my witness of Jesus Christ. The prophet Nephi warned his people, "Nothing can save this people save it be repentance and faith on the Lord Jesus Christ. Yea, how long will ye suffer yourselves to be led by foolish and blind guides?" Helaman 13:6 and 29. There is a wonderful lesson to be learned from the Jaredites and the Nephites. There is safety in following the prophets. I encourage all of us to follow the temporal and spiritual counsel of the latter-day prophets, seers, and revelators. Additional testimony and personal experience shared by Marion Law. In addition to what is expressed in Brother Law's autobiographical retelling of his Melbourne experience, many segments of the original 1983 Fireside transcript paint not only a more detailed account, but also highly pertinent information. So here come the increased details of the account heretofore told. Matters. This part of his account begins after he entered the home of the Melbourne man. I just barely began to explain the gospel, and the man said to me, "Mr. Law, we have a better plan." And I said, "What is your plan?" Then he began to unfold to me this experience that I'm telling you about tonight. But I was unable to leave the chair where I sat. It was as though I was physically bound, and I felt as though I was chained. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe, and he began to unfold this experience to me, a very foreboding feeling. I have felt the presence of evil, and I have had the experience of casting out evil spirits myself from a house, and I know what that's like, and this was the most terrifying thing in my life, as the man began to unfold this other plan. He said, "The nature of man occurs in 3 phases. First, man is an economic animal, and therefore it is necessary to for the state to control the economy so that we can have equality, and it will always be fair because man will always be inhuman to man until he can learn to control that side of his nature. Then he said the second part of man is that man is a political animal, and therefore it would be necessary for us to establish a dictatorship kind of government, what you would call a dictatorial form of government. But he said, when we bring into effect the third phase of our program, that won't be fearful anyway. Also, the third part, man is a spiritual animal. He said, we control some parts of the political world and some parts of the economic world. He said, we control all the churches except the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. He said, we have them in our control, and he said that when we have political and economic control of the world, we will then be able to establish our total spiritual program. He said, we have done research on thousands of animals and thousands of men. We know that they can create a perfect society, because that by using psychological manipulation and psychological conditioning through the use of drugs, diet, and music, and force where necessary, we can condition the mind of man so that he will be sinless. He said, there would be no sin as you define it. We don't believe in that, but you would call it sin. There would be no hate, no envy, no malice, no lust, no greed, no jealousy, no viciousness, none of those things that you would classify as sin. He said, if we were the gods, Mr. Law, how could God keep sinless souls out of heaven if there is a heaven? We don't believe in those things, but if there is, how could a just God keep a sinless soul out of heaven? He indicated that they would function as Plato's Republic functioned in the description of the Republic, that the leaders would not oppress the workers would not be envious of the leaders, and the teaching groups would perpetuate this sinless condition. And he said, if we could have started with the first thinking man, you claim that's Adam, but we don't believe in that myth either. We could have started with the first thinking man, he said, we would not have lost a single soul. He described the drug culture to me, something I just couldn't comprehend, and he described how it would be used to condition people. He described a process that 25 years later came into being, so we have literally become a part of that drug culture. Editor's note, which since the 1990s has evolved into the prescription drug culture for the middle class. As of 2011, a turning point has been reached where legal prescription drug deaths not only outnumber illegal drug deaths, they also outnumber nationwide traffic fatalities. We will use diet, he said. We will put into food things that will make it possible for us to condition people. Editorial note, as mentioned earlier, GMO foods, which is genetically modified organism foods, have things put in at the DNA level. The whole purpose of the program is to make us conditionable, so that we are susceptible to whatever they wish to teach us. But the thing that was most shocking and I didn't understand at the time was music. The key is the underlying beat that goes on, and it constantly changes. It is constantly changing. That's why you'll have several guitars and several instruments that are the same. The instruments are the same. They don't have a trumpet and saxophone and a violin, because what they need is the conditioning ability of those instruments. They need intense volume. They can deliver any message whatsoever, whether it is backward or forward. It doesn't matter whether you can hear the words in the language that you are speaking or whether it's exactly the opposite, but the brain will unscramble it and pick it up. And so we know, for example, that this melodic dissonance can create a conditioning effect so that you will believe whatever it is that you are taught. It is the beginning of the free love revolution. It is the beginning of the drug culture, the beginning of anti-authority revolution, the beginning of our deterioration of our respect for the flag, the country, the policemen, and all the institutions that hold the fabric of our society together. And so these things he described to me in great detail. It was fascinating. It was sort of overwhelming to me. He indicated that, of course, they would use force where necessary. He said to me that we'll take children from their parents early enough so that we can condition them. We eliminate all mental, emotional, and physical cripples at birth. They, of course, would have to be terminated. He said, we are now researching and doing experimentation with science so that we can extend the lifespan so that man can live forever. He said, "The day will come when we will be able to reach into the planets and create a whole universe of these perfect sinless souls." He said, "If you love everybody, you would embrace our plan. Yours is failing. You have admitted it. How many people have you brought into the light of the gospel?" "Well, not very many," I replied. He said, "You are right. But in our plan, every living soul will be saved." And I said, "Well, that's a great plan, but if everyone is going to have their free agency..." This guy was a very sophisticated, intellectual individual, and he said, "I can even prove it with your own arguments." He said, "Who do you love?" Well, just 2 or 3 months earlier, I got a Dear John letter from a girl I'd left behind, so I said, "I love my mother." He said, "I can prove you don't even love your own mother." He said, "We know, for example," he said, "that Mormons believe that straight is the gate and narrow is the way that leadeth to heaven, and few there be that find it." And I said, "Yes, oh yes, but there is..." The Melbourne man interrupted and said, "Don't tell me about the 3 degrees of glory. We also know that many are called, but few are chosen. Isn't that the Mormon doctrine? Many are called, but few are chosen." "Well, yeah," he said. "So that means your mother can choose hell if she wants." "Well, yeah. Or she might even fall through the cracks in the church," he said. "So you don't even love your mother. Under our plan, it's guaranteed that she'll be saved." I said, "But I can't force her to go into heaven." He said, "When she finds out how beautiful it is, if there will be such a place, and it is good as you say it is, she'll spend eternity thanking you for making sure that she was saved." "Well," he said, "that we're only lovers of humanity. We are the only ones who truly love our fellow man. You don't. You've prepared to let them go to hell. We don't want anybody to be hurt or abased or offended or wounded or punished or anything. Why should they be punished? We'll save them all. We'll condition their minds." He said, "We know we can do it. When we take political and economic control of the world, we will institute our spiritual part of the plan to you." And I said, "Well, boy, I have heard some of this before." He said, "That's not possible." He said, "You might have heard of the political part of the plan, but you might have heard of the economic part of the plan, but never the spiritual part of the plan." He said, "The spiritual part of the plan is not written or recorded. Only the hardcore elite are exposed to the spiritual part of our plan." And he said, "I'm one of those in Australia who controls our plan." And I said to him, "Why did you tell me?" He said, "I'm not sure. I felt inspired to tell you." Well, he asked me where I had heard of this plan of his. I said, "Well, I must have heard it in the councils of heaven." And he laughed at that. He said, "We would like to bring some of you young dedicated missionaries into our program." He said that the one thing we lack is dedication and commitment to our spiritual part of our plan. I said to him, "What is your plan? What is it? What do you call it?" He said, "I'm a member of the Central Planning Committee of the Communist Party in Australia. There are 3 of us who control it." And I said, "I've heard of communism." He said, "You have heard of the political communism and the economic communism." He said, "You have never heard of the spiritual communism." Now I've heard President David O. McKay talk about it since. Spiritual Satanism is what he called it. He defined communism as spiritual Satanism. I said, "You have to give people their right to choose." And he said, "They'll go to hell if they choose, and you're not saving anybody. How many people are in your church?" There was I think there was less than 1 million people, he said, out of 2.5 billion, and the rest of them are going to hell. Don't give me any of this 3 degrees stuff. He said, if they don't make it to the top, they haven't made it. After bearing my testimony of Jesus Christ, he became violently angry. He said, "We don't believe in that myth. That's a myth. That's a mystery. They are just parables." And I said, "No, I have heard the voice of the Lord, I have felt his power, and I know that Jesus Christ is the Son of God." This man became so violent with me, he attacked me, and only then I could break loose and run out in the middle of the street. My companion had to help me into the streetcar and then take me home. That 3-hour experience was a nightmare. I haven't taken the time to recount to you all the things, but he did go through in detail in the method in which he would use diet, the drugs, and the music I've explained to you. And I've explained to you just a little bit how they would introduce this music, and then the drugs, they would introduce it into our diet, our foods. Editor's note, he's not just referring to the introduction of illicit drugs beginning through the conduit of the hippie culture in the 1960s, but also drugs in our food and our diet as well. They would do all kinds of things that would condition us so that we would be susceptible and easily led. We would not fight against them, so that we would literally embrace their principles and those doctrines.